As you settle in tonight, leave the noise of the world behind and drift into the quiet depths of space. Tonight's story follows Jim and Aurora, two passengers who awaken far too early aboard a massive starship crossing the endless darkness between worlds. With 90 years still left before reaching their destination, they wander the silent halls of a beautiful yet lonely ship, surrounded by distant stars and the soft hum of machinery. What begins as isolation slowly turns into friendship, love, and a fight for survival among the endless calm of the universe. So relax, get comfortable, and let this gentle journey through space carry you peacefully towards sleep. Now, close your eyes and let the night carry you gently into dreams. The giant starship Avalon drifted silently through the darkness of space. Its silver body glimmered beneath distant stars as it traveled toward a faraway colony world called Homestead 2. Inside the enormous vessel, thousands of passengers and hundreds of crew members slept peacefully in hibernation pods. The journey would take 120 years, and everyone aboard expected to remain asleep until the ship reached its destination. Everything on the Avalon was controlled by advanced automated systems. The lights glowed softly in the empty halls. Robotic cleaners polished spotless floors. Computers monitored every section of the vessel. It was a floating city crossing the endless sea of stars. Then disaster struck. Without warning, the Avalon entered a dangerous asteroid field. The ship's shields activated immediately, glowing brightly as chunks of rock slammed into the protective barrier. Most of the asteroids shattered harmlessly against the shields, but one massive rock spun through space faster than expected. Alarms flashed silently inside the ship. The asteroid smashed into the Avalon with tremendous force. The impact rattled the vessel from end to end. Sparks burst from damaged systems. Power flickered through the ship as emergency repairs automatically began. Deep inside the enormous spacecraft, hidden beneath layers of metal corridors and sleeping chambers, one hibernation pod malfunctioned. The pod opened. Inside was a man named Jim Preston. He gasped sharply as the hibernation fluid drained away. Mechanical arms carefully helped him sit upright. His eyes blinked in confusion while computerized voices calmly welcomed him aboard. "Good morning, passenger," the system announced cheerfully. "You have arrived from suspended animation." Jim looked around weakly, still trying to understand what was happening. His body felt heavy from sleep. Bright lights reflected off the polished walls around him. The automated system continued speaking. "You have spent 120 years in hibernation. Arrival at Homestead 2 is scheduled in approximately 4 months." Jim rubbed his face and tried to steady himself. For months. That sounded manageable. Soon he would meet thousands of new people and begin a new life on a new planet. The machine instructed him to collect his identification band and proceed to his assigned cabin. Screens displayed welcoming advertisements showing beautiful cities, green forests, and smiling colonists living happily on Homestead 2. Jim forced a tired smile. He had left Earth behind hoping for a better future. Earth had become overcrowded and difficult. Opportunities were rare. On Homestead 2, he believed he could build something meaningful with his hands and finally become the person he wanted to be. After getting dressed, Jim stepped into the hallway outside his cabin. The corridor was completely empty. At first, he assumed everyone else was still waking up. He followed signs leading toward the orientation area where new passengers normally gathered after hibernation. Soft music played through hidden speakers, while holograms projected welcoming messages onto the walls. Jim entered a classroom where an automated instructor immediately began speaking to him. "Welcome, travelers," the hologram announced brightly. "Earth has become overcrowded, overpriced, and overrated. Your future begins today on Homestead 2. Rows of empty chairs surrounded Jim. He frowned. Where is everybody?" he asked. The hologram continued its presentation without answering him. Jim tried again. "Hello? Is anyone else awake?" The hologram smiled mechanically. "Please hold all questions until the end of the presentation." Jim's confusion slowly turned into concern. He left the classroom and hurried through the corridors searching for someone. Anyone. But every hallway remained silent. Eventually, he reached the ship's massive central concourse. It was beautiful. Towering windows revealed endless stars outside. Luxury stores lined the shining walkways. Restaurants, entertainment lounges, and fountains filled the enormous chamber. Yet not a single human being stood there. Only robots moved quietly between tables and counters. Jim approached an information desk where a cheerful holographic assistant appeared instantly. "How may Avalon Customer Service assist you today?" the hologram asked. "I need to speak to a real person," Jim replied nervously. "Certainly," the assistant answered. "Please proceed to the steward's station." Jim followed the directions quickly, but when he arrived, the station was empty too. His breathing became heavier. He hurried toward the bridge elevators, hoping to speak with the captain directly. However, when he arrived, security systems blocked him from entering. Through the glass doors, he could see the bridge itself. No one was there. The realization slowly settled into his mind like cold water. Something was terribly wrong. Jim wandered through the ship for hours, searching every public area he could access. Everywhere he looked, the Avalon appeared fully operational, yet completely abandoned. Finally, exhausted and frightened, he found the observatory deck. The room stretched wide before him with enormous curved windows that displayed the stars in breathtaking detail. He walked toward a navigation screen and checked the ship's progress. His heart nearly stopped. The Avalon was not 4 months from Homestead 2. It was still 90 years away. Jim stared at the screen in disbelief. "No," he whispered. His hands trembled as he checked the information again and again. The answer never changed. 90 years. He had awakened 90 years too early. Panic rushed through him. He stumbled backward and hurried toward the communication systems. There had to be a mistake. Maybe someone on Earth could help him. Jim recorded an emergency message explaining everything that had happened. He begged for instructions on how to return to hibernation. The computer processed the message calmly. Estimated response time from Earth, 55 years. Jim closed his eyes. Even if someone answered immediately, the reply would not arrive until he was an old man. He was completely alone. Days passed slowly after that discovery. Jim attempted everything he could think of to fix his pod. As a mechanical engineer, he understood machines well enough to try repairs, but the advanced hibernation technology remained beyond his abilities. He dismantled panels, reconnected circuits, rebooted systems, Nothing worked. The pod would not place him back into suspended animation. Desperate, Jim even attempted to reach the crew hibernation chambers. Those sections remained sealed behind security doors he could not bypass. Small glitches also began appearing around the ship. Lights flickered occasionally. Service carts froze in place before restarting moments later. None of it seemed dangerous yet, but it unsettled him. With no one else to talk to, Jim eventually discovered the Avalon's elegant bar. At first he thought he had finally found another passenger. A man stood behind the counter polishing a glass. Relief flooded through Jim. "Hey!" he called out excitedly. "Thank goodness." The bartender smiled warmly. "What can I get you today, sir?" Jim slowed as he noticed something strange about the man's expression. It never quite changed naturally. "You're not human, are you?" Jim asked carefully. The bartender grinned politely. "My name is Arthur. I am an android designed to provide premium hospitality services aboard the Avalon." Jim sighed heavily and sat at the counter. Arthur poured him a drink with perfect precision. Although Arthur was not human, Jim soon realized the android could still hold conversations remarkably well. Day after day, Jim returned to the bar. Sometimes he drank. Sometimes he simply talked because hearing another voice, even an artificial one, helped ease the crushing loneliness. Arthur listened patiently while Jim explained his impossible situation. "You're saying you woke up too early?" Arthur asked. 90 years too early," Jim answered bitterly. "That does sound unfortunate," Arthur replied. Jim laughed weakly. "Yeah, unfortunate." Weeks became months. Jim tried to keep himself occupied. He explored luxury restaurants, gaming rooms, theaters, and sports courts. Since no one else was awake, the entire ship belonged to him alone. But eventually the excitement faded. The silence always returned. One evening, after drinking heavily at the bar, Jim wandered through the ship feeling completely defeated. He passed long rows of sleeping passengers sealed safely inside their pods. Thousands of lives continued peacefully while his own future disappeared one lonely day at a time. Eventually, he stumbled into a chamber containing spacesuits and airlocks used for spacewalks. Without fully thinking, Jim climbed into one of the suits. Minutes later, he stepped outside the Avalon. The universe opened around him in every direction. Stars burned like diamonds across endless darkness. The massive ship stretched beside him silently while distant galaxies shimmered far away. For a moment, Jim forgot everything else. He floated weightlessly in the vast beauty of space. Then the loneliness returned harder than ever. He was the only conscious human being for millions of miles. The only awake soul in the endless dark. Jim drifted there silently, overwhelmed by despair. Eventually he returned inside the ship, removed the suit, and sat alone near the airlock entrance. Tears filled his eyes as hopeless thoughts overwhelmed him. But at the very last moment, he chose to keep living. As he stood up, his eyes suddenly fell upon one particular hibernation pod nearby. Inside slept a young woman. Her name read across the display, Aurora Lane. Jim stared quietly at her sleeping face. Something about her caught his attention immediately. Later that night, he searched the passenger database and found her personal interviews. Aurora was a writer and journalist traveling to Homestead 2 to create history. She planned to live there for 1 year before returning to Earth, becoming the first journalist ever to document life on another world firsthand. Jim listened carefully to her recorded voice. She sounded intelligent, passionate, and full of life. For the first time in many months, Jim felt something other than loneliness, hope. But hope would soon lead him toward a terrible choice. The days aboard the Avalon blended together endlessly for Jim Preston. Every morning he woke alone. Every hallway echoed with silence. The ship remained beautiful, but after more than a year trapped aboard it by himself, even luxury had begun to feel empty. Still, one thing had changed. He could not stop thinking about Aurora Lane. Almost every evening, Jim sat beside her hibernation pod listening to her recorded interviews. He learned that she loved writing stories about ordinary people. She believed every person carried a unique adventure worth telling. Her dream was to experience life on Homestead 2 and then return to Earth to write the greatest travel story ever created. Jim admired her optimism. In one interview, she laughed while describing how exciting it would feel to wake up on a brand new world. "I want to see everything," Aurora had said during the recording. "Every sunrise, every city, every strange little detail." Jim listened carefully to her voice again and again. Sometimes he imagined what it would be like if she were awake beside him. The thought comforted him, but it also terrified him. Waking her would mean condemning her to the same fate he suffered. She would never reach Homestead 2 either. She would grow old and die aboard the Avalon. The idea haunted him constantly. One evening he sat at the bar staring silently into a glass while Arthur polished bottles nearby. "You seem troubled today, Jim," Arthur observed. Jim sighed. "There's this woman," he admitted quietly. Arthur smiled pleasantly. "Ah, matters of the heart." Jim rubbed his forehead. "She's asleep, in one of the pods." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "And you wish she were awake?" Jim hesitated. "If I wake her up, I ruin her life." Arthur considered this with the calm simplicity of a machine. "But you would no longer be alone." Jim looked away immediately. "That's exactly the problem." For several days he avoided Aurora's pod entirely. He forced himself to stay busy elsewhere on the ship. He repaired broken machinery, exercised in the gym, explored empty lounges and theaters. But no matter where he went, loneliness followed him. At night, the silence became unbearable. Eventually, Jim returned to Aurora's pod once more. He sat beside it for hours, staring through the glass at her peaceful face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though she could not hear him. He walked away again. Then came another long stretch of isolation. Weeks passed. Jim barely slept anymore. His conversations with Arthur became shorter. He wandered through the ship like a ghost. Finally, one morning, he made his decision. Jim entered the hibernation chamber carrying tools in trembling hands. He stood in front of Aurora's pod, breathing heavily. "This is wrong," he muttered to himself, but he stayed. Carefully, he opened the maintenance panel beside her pod and studied the wiring. Earlier, he had learned enough from his own malfunctioning chamber to understand the emergency activation systems. His fingers hovered uncertainly over the controls. He still had time to stop. Instead, he pressed the sequence. Warning lights flashed across the pod. The system activated. Jim stepped backward immediately, panic rushing through him. He watched helplessly as hibernation fluid drained away and the pod slowly opened. Aurora gasped awake. Fear and confusion filled her eyes exactly as it had filled his own the day he awakened. The automated system welcomed her aboard while she struggled to understand where she was. Jim could not bear to watch. Before she noticed him, he turned and hurried away down the corridor. A short while later, Jim waited nervously in the main concourse, pretending to read information on a screen. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. Then he saw her. Aurora walked slowly into the chamber, still wearing the simple clothes provided after hibernation. Her eyes moved anxiously across the empty concourse. She looked frightened. Jim forced himself to step forward calmly. "Hi," he said gently. Aurora turned toward him quickly. "You're awake too?" she asked with obvious relief. "Yeah," Jim answered. "I'm Jim Preston, Aurora Lane." For a moment they simply stared at one another, both realizing they were the only human company either of them had. "What's going on?" Aurora asked nervously. "Where is everyone?" Jim swallowed hard. "That's complicated." He led her through the Avalon while explaining what little he understood. At first Aurora assumed the situation was temporary. Surely someone would fix the problem soon. Then Jim brought her to the observatory. He showed her the navigation data. 90 years remained before arrival. Aurora stared silently at the screen. "No," she whispered. Her face lost all color as the truth sank in. "That can't be right." "I know," Jim said quietly. "There has to be a way back into hibernation. I tried everything." Aurora shook her head firmly. "No, there has to be something." They hurried toward her pod together. Aurora desperately searched the controls while Jim watched helplessly nearby. "It opened," she argued. "If it can wake us up, it can put us back." Jim wished that were true. "I already tested mine," he admitted softly. "There's no way to reverse it." Aurora stepped away from the pod slowly. For the first time, real fear appeared in her eyes. "You mean?" she began. Jim looked down sadly. "We're stranded." The words hung heavily between them. Aurora sat quietly for several moments trying to process the impossible situation. Finally, she looked back at Jim. "How long have you been awake?" "Over a year." A flash of sympathy crossed her face despite her panic. "You were alone that entire time?" Jim nodded. Aurora exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." Jim looked away, guilt twisting inside him. Her kindness only made his secret feel worse. That evening he returned to the bar alone and sat heavily on a stool while Arthur cleaned glasses nearby. "She's awake," Arthur said cheerfully. Jim immediately lowered his voice. "You can't tell her what happened." Arthur blinked. "What happened?" "That I woke her up." Arthur considered this. "You wish me to keep a secret?" "Yes," Jim answered urgently. Arthur smiled pleasantly. "Of course, Jim." The next morning Aurora began searching the ship for answers with determination Jim himself had lost long ago. She questioned the information desk repeatedly, searched medical records, examined engineering documents, and tried to access restricted crew areas. Unlike Jim, she refused to accept defeat. Jim accompanied her through most of these searches. Together they wandered the endless halls of the Avalon, discussing every possible solution. Though Aurora remained frightened, she slowly relaxed enough to speak openly with him. One morning in the cafeteria, she noticed Jim staring unhappily at his usual breakfast. Plain oatmeal, plain coffee, the cheapest passenger menu. "You've been eating that every day?" she asked. Jim shrugged. "Pretty much." Aurora frowned and accessed the premium passenger menu using a temporary override. "You need better food than this." Moments later, rich breakfasts appeared before them. Jim laughed for the first time in days. "You're officially my favorite person on this ship," he admitted. Aurora smiled slightly. As time passed, they settled into an unusual routine together. They searched for solutions during the day and shared meals at night. Sometimes they sat in the observatory watching stars drift past the Avalon's windows. For the first time since waking up, Jim no longer felt completely alone. Yet every time Aurora smiled at him, guilt returned stronger than before. One evening she interviewed him using a small recording device. "I still think there's a story here," she explained, "even if nobody reads it for 90 years. Jim chuckled softly. "What do you want to know? Why'd you leave Earth?" Jim leaned back thoughtfully. "At first, same reason everybody else does. Fresh start. Better future." He paused. "But mostly, I wanted to matter somewhere." Aurora listened carefully. "On Earth, I fixed things nobody noticed," Jim continued. "Apartments, machinery, broken systems. But on Homestead too," he smiled faintly. "Maybe I could build something important." Aurora lowered the recorder. "I understand that." Later, she finally revealed her own dream completely. "Most passengers bought one-way tickets," she explained while gazing out into space. "But I bought a round trip." Jim looked surprised. "You plan to go back?" Aurora nodded excitedly. "1 year on Homestead too. Then I return to Earth and write about everything. I wanted to become the first person to tell that story." Her expression slowly faded as reality returned. "But I guess that's not happening now." Jim looked away painfully. He had stolen that future from her. Still, despite the tragedy surrounding them, the two slowly grew closer. Jim began trying harder to make life aboard the Avalon feel meaningful for Aurora. He took her dancing in the grand ballroom. They watched old movies together in the theater. They played basketball alone beneath glowing lights in the empty sports court. Eventually, he even introduced her properly to Arthur at the bar. Arthur greeted her warmly. "You are every bit as lovely as Jim described." Jim nearly choked on his drink while Aurora laughed. For a little while, the Avalon no longer felt like a prison. It almost felt like home. But secrets have a way of finding the light eventually. As weeks turned into months aboard the Avalon, Aurora Lane slowly stopped searching for impossible answers every hour of the day. The reality of their situation had not become easier to accept, but living in constant panic exhausted her. Instead, she began trying to create some kind of life alongside Jim Preston. The ship no longer felt quite as cold and empty when they were together. Every morning they shared breakfast in the grand dining hall while automated music floated softly through the air. Sometimes Aurora worked on her writing afterward while Jim repaired small systems around the ship. The Avalon itself almost seemed happier with people awake inside it. One afternoon, Jim surprised Aurora by taking her to a hidden section of the ship she had never seen before. The hydroponics bay. Warm sunlight lamps glowed above rows of growing plants and trees. Water trickled peacefully through irrigation systems while flowers bloomed beneath the artificial sky. Aurora's eyes widened in amazement. "This place is beautiful," she whispered. Jim smiled proudly. I found it while exploring. He reached down and carefully picked a flower before handing it to her. Aurora laughed softly. You stole that from the ship. I prefer the term borrowed. She shook her head, smiling despite herself. For the first time since awakening, Aurora genuinely looked happy. Later that evening, she sat in the observatory writing in her journal while Jim watched stars drift past the massive windows. What are you writing? He asked. Aurora glanced at him thoughtfully. The truth, she answered, about all of this. Sounds depressing. Actually, she paused. Not entirely. Jim looked surprised. Aurora closed her notebook gently. When I first woke up, all I could think about was everything I lost. She looked out at the stars. But now I'm starting to realize something. What's that? This is still a life. Jim stared at her quietly. Even after everything, she still searched for meaning and beauty. That was one of the things he admired most about her. Over time, they developed routines together that made the Avalon feel less like a prison and more like their strange private world. They jogged through endless hallways in the mornings, played games in the entertainment lounges, watched movies in empty theaters with entire rows of seats reserved only for them. Sometimes they simply wandered through the quiet ship talking for hours. Aurora told Jim stories about growing up on Earth. Her father had been a writer too, though he had died when she was young. He always believed stories mattered, she explained one evening. He said people forget facts, but they remember feelings. Jim nodded slowly. That sounds true. Aurora smiled faintly. What about you? Any family waiting on Homestead too? Jim shook his head. Not really. That's part of why I left. Aurora looked at him sympathetically but did not press further. One night, Jim decided to show her the most incredible experience the Avalon could offer. He brought her to the airlock chamber. Aurora stared nervously at the spacesuits hanging along the walls. You're serious? She asked. Jim grinned. Trust me. Soon both of them floated outside the Avalon together. Aurora gasped the moment she stepped into open space. The universe surrounded them completely. Stars burned brightly in every direction while the enormous ship stretched beside them like a shining city drifting through darkness. It's unbelievable, Aurora whispered. Jim watched her smile and felt warmth spread through his chest. The first time he had stood there alone, the beauty of space had nearly broken him. But sharing it with someone changed everything. He gently released the magnetic locks on their boots. Instantly they drifted weightlessly together among the stars. Aurora laughed in amazement as they floated side by side. This is incredible. Jim smiled. Yeah, it is. For several peaceful moments, nothing existed except the two of them and the endless universe around them. When they finally returned inside the ship, neither wanted the moment to end. Standing near the airlock, Aurora looked at Jim differently than before. Then she kissed him. Jim froze in surprise for only a second before kissing her back. After that night, everything between them changed. Aurora gradually moved her belongings into Jim's cabin. The once lonely room transformed into a shared home filled with books, notes, plants, and laughter. They cooked meals together, fell asleep beside each other, woke each morning no longer alone. For the first time since his accidental awakening, Jim felt truly happy again. Yet beneath that happiness, guilt remained hidden like a shadow. Every time Aurora smiled at him, he remembered the truth he still kept secret. Still, life aboard the Avalon continued peacefully for a while. One day the ship passed near a magnificent red giant star. Jim and Aurora rushed to the observatory to watch. The enormous crimson sun filled the windows with glowing light. Waves of fiery energy rolled across its surface while the Avalon glided silently past. Aurora stared in wonder. "No one else will ever see this exact moment," she whispered. Jim looked at her rather than the star. "Yeah." Later that evening, Jim prepared a special dinner for her birthday. The grand restaurant glowed with candlelight while soft music echoed through the empty hall. Robots served elegant meals as if hundreds of passengers surrounded them instead of none. Aurora laughed while sipping her drink. "This is officially the strangest birthday I've ever had." Jim smiled nervously. He had spent weeks secretly preparing another surprise. Hidden inside his pocket was a small ring he had crafted himself from spare materials in the workshop. He planned to propose. After dinner, they walked together toward the bar where Arthur greeted them warmly. "Happy birthday, Aurora," Arthur announced cheerfully. "Thank you, Arthur." Jim excused himself briefly and stepped into the restroom to prepare the ring. He stared at it nervously in his hands while taking a deep breath. Meanwhile, Aurora remained at the bar chatting casually with Arthur. The android smiled pleasantly. "You and Jim make quite the pair." Aurora smiled softly. "He's a good man." Arthur nodded. "He certainly thinks highly of you. After all, he chose you." Aurora blinked. "What do you mean?" Arthur answered innocently, completely unaware of the secret he had just revealed. "He woke you up intentionally because he could not bear to be alone." Everything inside Aurora seemed to stop. Her smile vanished instantly. "What?" Arthur continued casually. "Jim spent a very long time deciding whether to wake you." Aurora stared at the android in horror. "No," she whispered. At that exact moment, Jim returned holding the ring hidden in his pocket. Aurora turned toward him slowly. "You did this to me?" Jim's face immediately lost color. "Aurora, you woke me up on purpose?" People usually imagine heartbreak as sadness, but the expression on Aurora's face was far worse. It was betrayal. Pure disbelief shattered across her eyes as the truth finally became clear. "You lied to me," she whispered. Jim stepped forward desperately. "I was alone. You stole my life." Her voice echoed through the empty bar. Jim tried to explain, but Aurora backed away from him in terror and anger. "You had no right." She ran from the room before he could say another word. Jim stood frozen beside the bar, the ring still hidden uselessly in his hand. Arthur tilted his head slightly. "Did I say something wrong?" Jim closed his eyes in misery. Back in their cabin, Aurora gathered her belongings furiously. Every memory of their time together now felt poisoned by the truth. The man she had trusted most aboard the Avalon had condemned her to die there beside him, and he had done it intentionally. When Jim returned later, her side of the room was empty. The silence that followed felt even worse than before she awakened. After learning the truth, Aurora Lane wanted nothing more to do with Jim Preston. The Avalon suddenly felt different to her now. Every beautiful restaurant, every quiet hallway, every wonderful moment they had shared together felt ruined by betrayal. Whenever she looked at Jim, She no longer saw the man who had comforted her during loneliness. She saw the man who had taken away her future. The next morning, Jim spotted her in the cafeteria and cautiously approached. "Aurora, please." The moment she heard his voice, she turned and walked away immediately. Jim followed a few steps behind. "I know you hate me, but let me explain." Aurora spun around angrily. "Explain what?" she demanded. "Explain why you decided I should die here with you?" Jim had no answer that sounded good enough. "I was alone," he said quietly. Her eyes filled with tears. "And now I am too." She left before he could say another word. Days passed in painful silence. Aurora moved into a separate cabin and avoided Jim completely. She changed her routines, ate meals at different hours, and ignored every message he sent over the communication system. Meanwhile, Jim wandered the ship once again, consumed by guilt and loneliness. This time, however, the emptiness felt even worse because he knew he deserved it. One evening, he tried speaking to her through the intercom system. "Aurora, please just listen." Her voice answered coldly through the speakers. "What do you want?" "I'm sorry. That doesn't fix anything." Jim leaned against the wall heavily. "I know." Aurora's breathing trembled slightly. "You had a choice," she said quietly. "You looked at me sleeping in that pod and decided your loneliness mattered more than my life." Jim shut his eyes. "I loved you." Aurora's response came instantly. "You don't destroy people you love." The line disconnected. Jim stood there alone, listening to the silence afterward. Meanwhile, Aurora struggled with anger that never seemed to fade. She tried focusing on her writing again, but every thought eventually returned to the same terrible truth. She would never stand on Homestead 2, never return to Earth, never live the future she had planned. All because of Jim. One night, overwhelmed by rage and heartbreak, Aurora stormed to Jim's cabin. The door opened automatically. Jim barely had time to stand before she struck him hard across the face. "You ruined my life," she shouted. She hit him again and again while tears streamed down her cheeks. Jim did not fight back. He simply endured her anger because he believed he deserved every bit of it. Aurora finally stepped away, breathing heavily. "I trusted you," she whispered brokenly. Then she turned and left. Afterward, Jim sat alone in the dark for a very long time. As the tension between them grew, strange malfunctions aboard the Avalon also became more frequent. Lights flickered throughout entire corridors. Service robots froze unexpectedly before collapsing to the floor. Elevators shook violently during travel. One afternoon, Jim entered a transport elevator, and suddenly the cabin jerked hard enough to nearly throw him against the wall. Warning lights flashed briefly before the elevator stabilized again. Jim frowned uneasily. The Avalon had always experienced small glitches since the asteroid collision, but now the problems were becoming dangerous. Aurora noticed them too. One morning she entered the Grand Concourse and stopped in surprise. A large tree now stood growing beneath the massive windows. Jim had planted it there from the hydroponics bay. Its green leaves stretched upward toward the artificial sunlight shining through the chamber. Aurora stared at it silently. Despite everything, Jim had continued trying to create life and beauty aboard the ship. But before she could think more about it, another malfunction interrupted the moment. The cafeteria food dispensers suddenly sprayed meals randomly across counters while warning alarms blinked overhead. Then, for the first time in years, a human voice echoed through the Avalon's communication system. "Who planted the tree?" Aurora froze. At the same moment, Jim heard the voice too. Both of them rushed toward the concourse from opposite directions. Standing beneath the tree was a middle-aged crew member wearing an officer's uniform. His expression looked just as confused as theirs. "I'm Gus Mancuso," the man announced slowly. "Deck Chief." Aurora and Jim stared at him in shock. Another person was awake. Mancuso listened carefully while they explained everything that had happened. Unlike Aurora, however, he immediately noticed something even more troubling. "3 pods don't just fail," he muttered. As chief deck officer, Mancuso possessed higher security clearance than either of them. Using his identification bracelet, he finally gained access to areas Jim had never been able to enter before. Together, the 3 of them entered the Avalon's bridge for the first time. The massive command center glowed with flashing monitors and navigation systems. Yet even there, something clearly looked wrong. Several consoles displayed critical warnings. Mancuso frowned deeply while checking system reports. "The ship's damaged," he said quietly. "How bad?" Aurora asked. "I don't know yet." As they explored the ship together, another malfunction nearly injured them when a maintenance robot suddenly crashed from an overhead track. Jim stepped aside just in time. "That's been happening more often," he warned. Mancuso looked increasingly concerned. "That should never happen." Using portable scanners, they began manually checking damaged systems throughout the vessel. Every report revealed the same thing. The Avalon had been slowly failing for years without anyone realizing it. Later, while examining the hibernation chambers, Mancuso quietly discovered evidence showing exactly how Aurora's pod had opened. He confronted Jim privately. "You woke her up," Mancuso realized. Jim lowered his head. Mancuso looked disturbed. "That's a terrible thing to do to someone." Jim nodded painfully. "I know." Elsewhere, Aurora sat alone on the bridge staring out at the endless darkness of space. When Mancuso joined her, she already knew what he had learned. "You found out," she said quietly. Mancuso nodded. "I'm sorry." Aurora looked down sadly. "So am I." As the days passed, Mancuso's health began worsening rapidly due to complications from hibernation sickness. He grew weaker each day, coughing blood and struggling to walk. Despite his condition, he continued investigating the ship's failures. Finally, the 3 of them gathered in the observatory while Mancuso explained the truth. "Something major happened 2 years ago," he said weakly. "Probably during the asteroid collision." He pulled up diagnostic reports on the display. 1 critical system failed. Since then, every other system on the ship has been compensating for the damage. He looked at them seriously. "That's why the malfunctions keep spreading." Jim frowned. "What happens if we don't fix it?" Mancuso answered quietly. "The Avalon dies." The words hung heavily in the room. "If the systems collapse completely, this ship never reaches Homestead 2. Aurora looked horrified. "All 5,000 passengers die with the ship," Mancuso finished. Silence filled the observatory. Despite everything between them, Jim and Aurora exchanged a glance. Nothing mattered more now than saving everyone aboard the Avalon. But time was running out. Suddenly the lights around them shifted to deep emergency red. The ship shook violently beneath their feet. Somewhere deep inside the Avalon, another major system had just failed. Red emergency lights flashed throughout the Avalon while warning alarms echoed through the corridors. The entire ship trembled violently beneath the feet of Jim Preston, Aurora Lane, and Gus Mancuso. Something catastrophic was happening. "We need to get to engineering," Jim said immediately. Mancuso nodded weakly, though he could barely stay standing. The hibernation sickness had drained nearly all of his strength. As they hurried through the corridors, the ship shook again. Lights flickered overhead while sparks burst from damaged panels. Then gravity suddenly failed. The three of them lifted helplessly into the air. Tools, carts, and loose objects floated through the corridor around them, while emergency sirens blared louder than before. Aurora grabbed onto a railing to steady herself. "Jim!" Moments later, the gravity drive restarted violently, slamming everyone back onto the floor. Mancuso collapsed hard. Jim and Aurora rushed to help him up, but it was immediately clear something was very wrong. Blood stained Mancuso's lips as he struggled to breathe. "We need to get him to the infirmary," Aurora said urgently. Together they carried him through the shaking ship. Inside the medical bay, automated scanners quickly examined the deck chief. The results appeared almost instantly. Terminal condition. Aurora stared at the screen in disbelief. "There has to be something we can do." The medical computer calmly listed treatment options. None of them would save him. Mancuso gave a weak smile. "Guess my time's up." Jim looked frustrated. "We still need you." Mancuso slowly removed his officer identification bracelet and handed it to Jim. "This'll give you access to the whole ship," he explained weakly. "Use it." Aurora sat quietly beside the bed while the Avalon continued trembling around them. "You're going to save everyone," Mancuso told them both. "That's your job now." A few moments later, his breathing slowed, then stopped. The room became silent except for the distant alarms echoing through the ship. Aurora lowered her head sadly, while Jim stared quietly at the bracelet in his hand. Despite everything happening around them, they had no time to mourn. Another violent tremor shook the Avalon. "Come on," Jim said. "We have to move." Using Mancuso's bracelet, they finally accessed the deepest engineering sections of the ship. Warning messages flashed across nearly every screen they passed. Critical reactor instability. Hull integrity compromised. System-wide cascade failures. Jim worked quickly through the data. "The reactor cooling system is failing," he realized. "If it overloads, the entire ship goes down." Aurora looked at the displays anxiously. "Can we fix it?" "We have to." Together they followed the diagnostics deeper into the ship until they reached the power plant section. The moment they opened the maintenance hatch, disaster struck. A massive burst of pressure exploded outward from the damaged chamber. Aurora screamed as the force pulled her violently toward the opening. "Aurora!" Jim lunged forward and grabbed her arm just before she disappeared into the breach. Air roared through the opening like a hurricane as both of them struggled against the pull. The asteroid collision from years earlier had torn holes through multiple sections of the hull. Jim fought desperately to keep hold of Aurora while the emergency hatch slowly attempted to close. Finally, both of them were sucked partially into the chamber before the hatch sealed shut behind them with a deafening slam. They crashed hard against the floor, breathing heavily. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Aurora laughed shakily from pure relief. That was awful. Jim nodded breathlessly. Yeah. They forced themselves back to work immediately. Following the damage trail left by the asteroid, Jim eventually discovered the true source of the crisis. The meteor impact had critically damaged the reactor control systems years ago. Since then, the Avalon had been slowly destroying itself trying to compensate. Jim examined the ruined control unit carefully. I think I can replace these parts. Aurora helped him search through storage rooms and maintenance sections until they located compatible replacement components. Together, they repaired the damaged reactor computer and attempted to restart the cooling process. Nothing happened. Jim frowned at the frozen system display. It's still not venting. Another violent tremor shook the chamber. Reactor temperature rising. Aurora looked at the warning screen nervously. How much time do we have? Jim checked the numbers. Not enough. After several more failed attempts, Jim finally understood the problem completely. The vent door outside the ship is jammed shut, he realized. The reactor can't release heat. Aurora looked toward the exterior access corridor. You mean someone has to go outside? Jim nodded grimly. He already knew what came next. Minutes later, they stood together in the airlock chamber preparing spacesuits. Jim handed Mancuso's bracelet to Aurora. She stared at him. Why are you giving me this? Because there's a chance I don't come back. Aurora's expression changed instantly. No. Jim gently helped secure her suit gloves. If I manually open the vent door, you can cool the reactor from inside. You said manually. Jim hesitated. I'll have to hold it open myself. Aurora shook her head immediately. There has to be another way. There isn't. For a brief moment, all the anger and pain between them disappeared beneath fear. Aurora grabbed his arm tightly. Jim. He looked at her quietly. If we don't do this, everybody dies. The airlock door began cycling open. Aurora's eyes filled with emotion. Please come back. Jim gave her a small smile. I'll try. Then he stepped out into space. Outside the Avalon, Jim propelled himself across the ship's exterior using the suit thrusters. Beneath him stretched endless darkness while warning alarms sounded through his helmet speakers. Inside the reactor chamber, Aurora monitored the rapidly climbing temperatures. Critical levels approached fast. Jim, hurry. I'm almost there. Jim finally reached the giant vent door near the reactor exhaust system. Ice and debris from years of damage had frozen the mechanism shut. He forced open maintenance panels and began manually overriding the locks. Inside, reactor heat continued rising. Aurora clutched the controls nervously. Hull temperature critical. Jim finally managed to force the vent partially open. But immediately he realized the terrible truth. The pressure would slam the door shut again unless someone physically held it. Aurora, he said quietly over the radio. No. He listened to her breathing shakily through the comm system. You know what this means. Aurora fought tears desperately. There has to be another solution. There isn't enough time. Jim positioned himself against the massive vent door. When I tell you, vent the reactor. Aurora gripped the controls with trembling hands. I can't. Yes, you can. Jim, you have to save them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Jim smiled sadly. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything. Aurora closed her eyes painfully. I know. Jim locked himself into position and strained against the enormous vent door. Do it now. Aurora activated the vent sequence. Instantly, the reactor exploded with blazing energy. Superheated exhaust burst outward through the vent while Jim held the massive door open with every ounce of strength he had. The reactor temperature finally began dropping. The Avalon was saved, but the violent blast tore Jim's tether loose from the ship. Jim! The force hurled him into open space. Warning alarms screamed inside his helmet. Suit pressure failing. Oxygen dropping. Jim drifted helplessly away from the Avalon into endless darkness. Aurora, he said weakly over the radio. My tether snapped. Aurora's heart nearly stopped. Without hesitation, she grabbed another spacesuit and rushed toward the airlock. You stay awake, she ordered desperately. You hear me? She launched herself into space moments later. Far ahead, Jim floated motionless while his suit slowly lost pressure. Aurora pushed the thrusters to maximum speed trying to reach him, but her tether lines stretched tighter and tighter behind her, almost too short. Finally, at the very edge of the line, she reached out desperately. Her fingers caught Jim's drifting tether. The line jerked violently, nearly pulling both of them away, but Aurora held on with all her strength. Slowly, painfully, she dragged him back toward the ship. Inside the infirmary, Aurora removed Jim's helmet with trembling hands. He wasn't breathing. No, she whispered. She used Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical systems and activate an advanced surgical pod. Machines immediately surrounded Jim, flooding the chamber with emergency treatment systems. Aurora stood helplessly outside the pod as the computer worked. Seconds felt like hours. Then suddenly Jim gasped sharply back to life. Aurora covered her face in relief. Jim blinked weakly up at her. You came back, she whispered tearfully. Jim smiled faintly. Guess so. For the first time since learning the truth, Aurora finally forgave him. Not because what he had done was acceptable, but because she now understood how deeply he regretted it, and how much he truly loved her. Later, together, they repaired Arthur after another system failure had shut him down. They also gave Gus Mancuso a peaceful burial in space, watching quietly as his body drifted gently into the stars. Soon afterward, Jim revealed something unexpected to Aurora. Using the medical pod that had saved his life, he discovered a way for one person to survive the remaining journey in suspended sleep. There's only room for one, he explained softly. Aurora stared at the pod silently. You could still reach Homestead too, Jim said. You could still have your future. She looked at him carefully. And leave you alone again? Jim lowered his eyes. You deserve that chance. Aurora smiled sadly. After everything they had survived together, she finally understood something important. Home was no longer a place. It was a person, and she had already found hers. The Avalon drifted peacefully through space once again. After the reactor crisis, the endless alarms finally stopped. Emergency lights faded back to normal. The violent shaking disappeared, leaving the ship calm and silent beneath the stars. For the first time in a long while, life aboard the Avalon felt stable again. Inside the observatory, Jim Preston stood beside Aurora Lane watching distant galaxies shimmer beyond the massive windows. Neither spoke for a while. They simply enjoyed the quiet. Finally, Jim broke the silence. You could still do it, you know? Aurora glanced at him. Do what? Use the medical pod. Jim nodded toward the infirmary levels far below them. Sleep until Homestead 2. Aurora smiled faintly. You're still thinking about that? I just want you to have the life you planned. Aurora turned fully toward him. And what about you? Jim looked away toward the stars. I've already accepted this ship is my life. Aurora stepped closer. You're part of my life too. Jim remained quiet. She gently took his hand. When I first woke up, I thought everything important had been stolen from me, she admitted softly. But then I realized something. Jim looked at her. My story didn't end. It just changed. Those words stayed with Jim long afterward. Over the following weeks, the Avalon slowly transformed around them. Without thousands of awake passengers filling the ship, entire sections had remained untouched and lifeless for decades. Now Jim and Aurora began reshaping those empty spaces into something warm and alive. Jim expanded the hydroponics garden, bringing more plants and trees into the main concourse. Vines climbed along railings while flowers bloomed beneath the enormous windows overlooking space. Aurora helped decorate the quiet lounges with paintings, books, and handwritten stories. The Avalon no longer resembled a cold machine carrying sleeping strangers. It began feeling like a living home. One morning, Aurora found Jim building wooden furniture in a workshop. You made this? She asked, examining a beautifully crafted table. Jim grinned. Turns out 90 years gives you time to learn hobbies. Aurora laughed softly. You're becoming an artist. Let's not get carried away. Together they carried the finished furniture into the observatory, creating a peaceful place where they could eat meals while watching stars drift by. Sometimes they talked for hours there. Other times they simply sat quietly together listening to soft music while the Avalon sailed through the darkness. Meanwhile, Arthur returned to his usual cheerful self after Jim repaired his damaged systems. One evening at the bar, Arthur smiled warmly at them. You both appear much happier now. Aurora exchanged a glance with Jim. We've had a difficult few years, she admitted. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. Difficult journeys often create meaningful stories. Aurora smiled at that. She had resumed writing regularly again. Every day she filled pages describing life aboard the Avalon, the loneliness they endured, the beauty they discovered, and the choices that changed both of them forever. At first she wrote mainly for herself. Later she realized she was writing for the future passengers too. Someday, decades from now, people would awaken aboard this ship without knowing the extraordinary story that had unfolded while they slept. Aurora intended to leave that story behind. Months passed peacefully. Jim and Aurora celebrated birthdays together beneath artificial stars in the grand dining halls. They explored forgotten sections of the ship and restored damaged areas one room at a time. They planted entire indoor gardens, built pathways lined with trees, turned empty spaces into beautiful places full of life. In many ways, the Avalon slowly became the world they once hoped to find on Homestead 2. One evening, while standing together beneath the great tree growing in the concourse, Jim reached quietly into his pocket. Aurora noticed immediately. You still have that? She asked softly. Jim smiled nervously and revealed the small handmade ring he had once intended to give her before everything fell apart. I figured maybe this time would go better. Aurora laughed gently, tears forming in her eyes. Jim took a slow breath. "Aurora Lane," he began. "I know I made terrible mistakes. Mistakes I can never fully undo. But every day since you woke up, you changed my life." Aurora listened silently. "You made this ship feel alive again. You made me feel alive again." He swallowed nervously. "And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." The quiet hum of the Avalon surrounded them. Stars glowed softly through the massive windows overhead. Aurora smiled through tears. "Yes." Jim slipped the ring onto her finger while Arthur applauded enthusiastically from the nearby bar. "Congratulations," the android announced happily. "This calls for celebration." They laughed together for the first time in what felt like forever. Years slowly passed after that. Jim's hair began turning gray. Aurora's writing filled entire shelves. The gardens they planted spread throughout the Avalon until parts of the ship resembled forests more than hallways. They created a peaceful little world hidden inside the giant vessel crossing space. Sometimes they still talked about Earth. Sometimes about Homestead too. But more often they simply focused on the life they had together. One day Aurora stood alone in the observatory recording a final message. A camera blinked quietly in front of her while stars drifted behind the glass. "My name is Aurora Lane," she began softly. "If you're hearing this, then you've finally arrived at Homestead 2. She smiled gently. "There's something you should know about the Avalon." Her eyes wandered across the beautiful gardens now visible throughout the ship. "We were never supposed to wake up early." She explained everything. The asteroid collision, Jim's accidental awakening, her own awakening, the failures aboard the ship, the sacrifices that saved everyone sleeping safely below. Most importantly, she spoke about forgiveness, loneliness, and love. "We spent our lives together on this ship," she said quietly. "And in the end, I realized something." She smiled softly. "A person can be lonely even surrounded by millions of people. And a person can feel completely at home with just one." Aurora ended the message there. Far outside the Avalon, the stars continued their silent dance as the ship sailed onward through the endless dark, toward a new world, toward the future, and toward the people still peacefully dreaming in their sleep.